The Electoral College is a group of presidential electors that are convened every 4 years to elect the American president. Now, I know there's a lot of focus on there, and a lot of people don't understand how the Electoral College is actually convened. The Electoral College is convened by having representatives from every state come together on the Democratic side and on the Republican side. So whichever party wins that state, its own slate of presidential electors will now go to the Electoral College in order to elect the president. Yes. So the Electoral College makes sense on one standpoint. I mean, it's part of the national constitution, and it's because the United States is so large. It's comprised of 10 million kilometers, for example, broken up into 50 states. And some are more populated than others. And as a result, the ones that are more populated, if we go by what's called the popular vote, then it is the will of just those in the cities that will actually elect a president. But because there are others that are in the suburbs, out in the country where there's farmland, in places like Montana where there's not a whole lot of people, the Electoral College was formed to make sure that those people also have a voice. So, for example, what happened in 2020 with Florida, where Biden, for example, got a lot of votes in Miami, in Tallahassee, Florida, in urban areas. But when you look at Florida as a whole, there are a lot of places, for example, in Pensacola, what's called the table, where Biden got a lot of votes, for example, in a lot of the urban areas, in Miami, in Tallahassee, Florida, in Orlando, Florida. But in the more rural areas of Florida, Trump actually persevered there. So as a whole, when you look at the state as a whole, he was the one who won Florida, even though Biden did very well in certain areas. So we don't take the popular vote, we take them state by state. So that's what happened. Okay. The numbers vary based upon the population of that state. So every state in the United States has 2 senators, and then based on population will have a certain allotted a certain member of Congress. So the Electoral College is made up of 2 people that are guaranteed for each senator, and then 1 person each for every member of Congress. So, for example, Pennsylvania has 20 electors, but California has 35, and that's because of the size of the state and the population it is. In District of Columbia, for example, where I'm from, there are only 3 electors. So it varies based on the population of the state and how many House of Representative members they have. That's a very good question. And I know increasingly as we look at the numbers, it appears as if there could be a statistical tie. But given how the electoral votes are panning out between the states, that's not likely to happen. However, there is a provision that where there is an electoral college tie, that tie is broken by the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So while the Democrats have a lead in the House of Representatives, the Senate, as you know, is governed by the Republicans, who have a majority. So if there's a tie and each person gets 269 votes instead of the required 270, then that tie will be broken by the House. And right now, that would go in favor of Donald Trump. There is a provision that where there is an electoral college tie, that tie is broken by the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So, this year, mail-in ballots came as a result of the COVID-19 response. There was some considerations or some concern that people will not be able to get to the polls because of the pandemic. And also those who didn't want to risk themselves going to the polls because maybe they were in in high-risk category or something like that. And so the legislators came up with this mail-in ballot so that people can actually request a mail-in ballot and then send it in. It's strategic, to be honest with you. So, of course, you have the Republican Party and you have the Democratic Party, and they both approached this election very differently. So, the Democrats approached this election by saying, listen, there's a pandemic out there. We want you to be comfortable. We want you to be safe. And so we want you to request a mail-in ballot and go ahead and send it in. Okay? So that you don't have, there's no pressure for you to come out and expose yourself to the pandemic. The Republicans, on the other hand, said, there's no pandemic. Don't worry about mail-in ballots. We want you to show up that day, show up for Donald Trump and vote in person. So that's essentially what happened. Now, where you see the disparity in the votes is the fact that in some states, their own state legislature said, whenever we get mail-in ballots, we're going to count them ahead of time, for example, in Florida, so that when the in-person voting happens, that we will now add those to the mail-in ballots, right? So that's why Florida's results came out really, really quickly, because they had already counted their mail-in ballots. On the flip side is Pennsylvania, who said, we're going to prioritize our in-person ballots and then count our mail-in ballots afterwards. And so that's why you saw that because they were counting their in-person ballots first, Trump was winning. But then when they started counting their mail-in ballots based on the strategy that the Democrats had of mail-in your ballot, then that's why Biden now started catching up, which was also the reverse in Florida. For example, if you remember, on Tuesday, Biden was winning at first, and everybody's like, oh, the Democrats are going to take Florida, and it was a toss-up state. But then when they started counting the in-person votes, that's when Trump took over. Not at all. I mean, if I go back to 2016, for example, there were things like voter intimidation. In Georgia, for example, people would go to the polls and the machines were broken, so they were unable to vote. What has happened this year is with the abundance of mail-in votes, all that sort of voter suppression was actually canceled, right? And so you see that actually more people actually voted in this election than voted in 2016, or even for Obama, and that was like record numbers. And so these numbers are elevated because many more people came out to actually vote. So in that instance, because of everything that's happened with COVID and mail-in versus that, I mean, people are looking at it different. Like, why is this election so different? The thing is the strategy. Both candidates did not have the same strategy. And Trump really wanted his votes to be counted on election day. And as far as he's concerned, anything that came before or after should not be counted. But there's a law that says if your ballot was stamped the day of the election, then it is a valid vote. So while they're not counting any votes that came later on, they've been asked to put them to the side. Anything that came before or that day in the mail is counted. So I think it's just strategy, because both parties use different strategies to approach this election. He's trying to say that his strategy is the only one that is going to work. However, these are valid votes that were mailed in and should be counted. Good question, because a lot of people have been asking the difference between an absentee ballot and a mail-in ballot. So a mail-in ballot for this particular election has been people, like I said earlier, who didn't maybe want to expose themselves the day of voting, and so decided to do a mail-in ballot. They would request a mail-in ballot, fill it out, and then mail it. They would either put it in the mail or physically drop it off at a drop-off center, right? Now, the absentee ballot has always been there, and that absentee ballot is for United States citizens who will not be in country or in their particular constituency the day of the vote. So this, for example, happens to, Nigerian Americans, somebody like me, for example, who could be in Nigeria the day of the election and would request an absentee ballot in order to make sure that their vote counts. And so they would cast an absentee ballot. Or, for example, people in the military who are serving overseas in Germany and all these places around the country, around the world, who say, I'm not going to be there in the States, but I want my vote to count. And so they request an absentee ballot and they send that in.